Good afternoon. I'm Stephen Little, curator and head of the Chinese and Korean department at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And I'd just like to say what a great pleasure it is to be here, and I'd also like to thank the organizers for putting this great conference together. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker this afternoon, Dr. Meredith Martin, who is assistant professor of art at Wellesley College. She is a specialist on 18th century French art and architecture, with special focus on the relationship of art and politics, and especially gender and cultural politics. I'll just mention quickly two of her books. Recently published in 2011, Dairy Queen, The Politics of Pastoral Architecture, from Catherine de' Medici to Marie Antoinette. And she's the co-editor in 2010 of Architectural Space in 18th century Europe, Constructing Identities and Interiors. She's currently researching art and ritual in diplomacy in early modern France, focusing on intercultural and artistic exchanges between France and India, and also France and Thailand. Also the Ottoman Empire. So please join me in welcoming Meredith Martin.
Hello again, and thank you again to the Getty for hosting this exciting event, and thank you all for coming and staying through the afternoon. My talk for today is part of a larger project that Stephen just mentioned on diplomatic, commercial, and cross-cultural exchanges in France from the reign of Louis XIV to the era of Napoleon. By studying diplomatic embassies that were sent between France and Siam, or Thailand, Persia, the Ottoman Empire, and India, I intend to explore the mutually transformative impact that these embassies had on artistic production, cultural understanding, scientific and technical knowledge, politics, and identity. And so I'm excited to present a new piece of that project to you today, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback. I want to begin my talk by showing a painting that actually dates from the 1860s, but that depicts a lavish 1686 reception given by Louis XIV to ambassadors from Siam, Thailand, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The painting was made by a French academic artist named Jacques Leman and was shown in Paris at the Salon of 1867, at a time when the French government was not only attempting to associate itself with the glories of the Ancien Regime, but was also making imperialist advances in Southeast Asia and was calling upon history to establish a precedent for France's involvement there. And so this is contemporary to the moment in which southern Vietnam became a French colony in 1862 and Cambodia became a French protectorate in 1863. Le Mans' painting looks back to 17th century images of this historic event, such as this drawing by Charles Lebrun, which was in the collection of the École des Beaux-Arts at the time. It is also in dialogue with a more contemporary monumental painting that had been commissioned by the French government and unveiled 2 years earlier at the Paris Salon. Made by Jean-Léon Gérôme, a painter of historical and Orientalist subjects, it represents an audience that the French Emperor Napoleon III and his wife Eugénie had given to a group of Siamese ambassadors at the Royal Palace of Fontainebleau in 1861. Gérôme's painting is at once a scrupulous documentary rendering of this diplomatic event and an ideological construction in which the Siamese, as Albert Boehm has argued, are meant to appear subservient to their European hosts. At least that was the painting's intention, and it's one that's culturally contingent upon viewing the crouched posture of the Siamese ambassadors, which corresponds to their own protocol for appearing in front of a sovereign, as demeaning rather than reverential. And this is how many 19th century French commentators on the painting saw it. Like that of the diplomatic encounter that it portrayed, Gérôme's painting was designed to celebrate France's past and present glory, as well as to validate its commercial and imperial ambitions in Siam, Vietnam, and Cambodia. However, as I've explored elsewhere, neither Gérôme nor Le Mans' painting actually succeeded in doing the ideological work that each set out to do, partly because of deep ambivalence about French foreign policy in this period, and partly because they proposed a comparison between Napoleon III and heroic French rulers of the past, in which the emperor himself fell short. But what is more interesting for our purposes is the fact that these images had a rich afterlife beyond their lackluster reception in France. In 1865, a copy of Gérôme's painting was made at the request of the King of Siam's consul in Paris by another French artist, Jean-Marius Fuchs, who traveled with his painting to Bangkok and later became the official painter to the King of Siam, Rama IV, who is known in the West as King Mongkut, and he's perhaps best known for his portrayal by Yul Brynner in The King and I. In 1882, not long after Gérôme's copy, or the copy of Gérôme's painting arrived, Mongkut or his son and heir, Chulalongkorn, acquired Le Mans' painting from the Paris Salon. In 1882, Chulalongkorn made both of these works part of an installation of 4 paintings depicting diplomatic exchanges between Siam, France, and England for the new throne hall of his royal palace in Bangkok. And unfortunately, I don't have an installation view, but here's a photograph of the building itself, where the paintings are still on display to this day. For Mongkut and his son, these images did not signify Siamese subservience to French imperial authority, but rather a strategic attempt to forge alliances with the West and to adopt certain Western art and architectural codes as a way to maintain Siam's sovereignty and to fashion a new Thai royal identity. And this was a kind of hybrid identity, if I can use that term, that this building also expresses. In this case, the physical and cultural transfer of these 2 French paintings resulted in them finding a more permanent home and in effectively serving a royal regime, just not the one for which they were originally intended. So I spent the first few minutes of my talk lingering on these 19th century examples, partly because they embody so well a major theme of this conference, the idea that the mobility of objects can lead to new meanings, uses, and interpretations. But they're also a useful point of departure for thinking about the 17th century diplomatic encounter between France and Siam that they either illustrate or evoke. When King Mongkut's ambassadors came to Paris in 1861 to ratify a commercial treaty that he had signed with Napoleon III, French diplomatic officials took them to the print room at the Imperial Library, now the Bibliothèque Nationale, and showed them French prints from the 1680s that represented Louis XIV's reception of the Siamese ambassadors at Versailles, as well as a corresponding audience that had been given by the Siamese king, Phra Narai, to a French ambassador the previous year. And here are 2 of the prints that members of this 1861 delegation looked at. When they were originally created, these prints had been intended to function as propaganda tools that glorified Louis XIV and presented France as the dominant power in this diplomatic exchange. The image on the left is an almanac print, a type of large broadsheet, so nearly 2 feet high, but nearly 2 feet across by, 2 by 3, and actually smaller than it appears on the screen, but still quite a large print, that was produced and sold in Paris near the end of each year, and that typically featured some kind of aggrandizing royal image that was distributed to a wide audience. Here, the printmaker has played with the scale and compressed the space so that Louis XIV appears to tower above these members of the delegation, who are squashed between an oversized vase on the left and another ornamental framing device on the right. Below them are vignettes representing French missionary activity in Asia and maps that depict territories formerly controlled by the Ottoman Empire that had recently been brought under European command. On the right is a print depicting the French ambassador Chaumont, who is here, being received by Phra Narai in the audience hall of his royal palace at Ayutthaya, north of Bangkok. Chaumont presents the Siamese king with an official letter from Louis XIV. The image represents an awkward moment during this ceremony when Chaumont, who had at first refused to follow Siamese custom and prostrate himself before the king, then refused to raise the plate on which Louis XIV's letter rested high above his head so that Narai would not have to compromise his authority by bending down to get it. Chaumont later recast this episode as a diplomatic triumph, whereby he had preserved Louis XIV's dignity by not having to display deference to Narai. And upon his return to France, he touted his victory in texts and prints like this one. When King Mongkut's ambassadors saw this print in 1861, they reportedly, according to French newspaper accounts, expressed disbelief at Narai's bent posture and asked their French hosts about it. It is because, they were told, Louis XIV was, quote, a great power who bowed to no one and to whom the whole world bowed, end quote. On the occasion of this 1861 delegation, several French books were also written about these earlier diplomatic exchanges that offered a similar narrative of Louis XIV's dominance, and they're books that are still frequently cited as sources on these embassies today. What all of these texts and images ended up obscuring were the more balanced, mutually dependent relations that existed between France and Siam in the 17th century. And so I want to spend the next several minutes fleshing out that history. Their relationship had begun in the early 1660s, when a group of French foreign missionaries had arrived in Siam and sought out an audience with Fra Narai, who allowed them to erect a seminary on the outskirts of his palace at Ayutthaya. On the left is a photograph of the ruins of Ayutthaya, which was almost completely destroyed by Burmese forces in 1767, and on the right is a rudimentary map of the palace complex made by a French Jesuit missionary in the late 1680s. It indicates the location of the French seminary here, not far from the palace up here, and there are two Portuguese churches down here, and it's interesting what the artist chooses to include in this image. Ayutthaya in this period was an extremely cosmopolitan place. European traders and missionaries referred to it as the Venice of the East, and you can see that this was partly because of the canals that ran through the palace complex, as well as the river that encircled it. Cosmopolitanism was a key component of Fra Narai's royal image, which he was just beginning to shape in the early 1660s, having acceded to the throne in 1656, and this was almost exactly contemporary with Louis XIV's own rise to power. Not only did Narai welcome French and Portuguese missionaries, Dutch VOC officers, Persian merchants, and other foreigners to his court, but he commissioned buildings that reflected his pluralistic attitude and global trading connections at Ayutthaya and at Lopburi, a second palace complex that he established beginning in the mid-1660s. Lopburi was often referred to by European travelers in the period as the Siamese Versailles. The structures at Lopburi, especially those built to receive or house foreign dignitaries, featured Dutch-style gables and pointed arches that had appeared in Siamese architecture before, but not in this fashion. And you see examples here and here. French and Thai historians of the 19th century, both of whom had a vested interest in documenting historic links between Siam and the West, claimed that these arches derived from French Gothic precedents, but a more likely source, as John Listopad has noted, was the court architecture of Safavid Iran, such as the Ali Kapu Palace complex that you see on the right. One Persian emissary who visited Siam in the 1680s wrote of how Narai, quote, sent everywhere for pictures depicting the mode of living and the courts of foreign kings, end quote. And he claimed, for obvious reasons, that Narai was particularly interested in Persian architecture and culture. But the buildings at Ayutthaya and Lopburi were also outfitted with Japanese lacquer screens, with pieces of Chinese porcelain that were set into wall niches during important festivals and ceremonies, and with European paintings and furnishings. They advertised Siam's status as a global entrepot, while also embodying Narai's foreign policy, which was to cultivate contacts with a variety of different foreign powers, and, if necessary, to play them off one another. French missionaries and traders who traveled to Siam in the 1660s and 70s sent back enthusiastic reports of its diversity and splendor and of Narai's receptivity to foreigners. Louis XIV and his minister Colbert were looking for a way to break into the lucrative Asia trade. Their fledgling French East India Company, founded in 1664, was struggling in this period to compete with those of the English and the Dutch. Wary of increasing Dutch VOC presence in his region, and swayed by reports of Louis XIV's military victories during the Franco-Dutch Wars of the 1670s, Narai agreed to establish diplomatic contacts with France. He sent an initial embassy there in 1680, which shipwrecked off the coast of Africa, followed by two others that did reach France in 1684 and 1686. The 1686 embassy is the best known and was accompanied by Chaumont, who traveled back with Narai's ambassadors on the same boat. Prior to their departure from Siam and during their journey, Chaumont sent ahead detailed reports about the magnificence of Narai's court, complementing other reports that Louis XIV had already been receiving from French traders and missionaries. He also described Narai's diplomatic ceremonial, and Louis XIV and his administrators used this information to develop their own protocol for receiving the Siamese envoys. For instance, the ambassador's journey from the French port of Brest to Paris was modeled on a lavish tour that Chaumont had taken from the port of Bangkok upriver to Ayutthaya, stopping along the way to be greeted by local officials. These two watercolors on the left, made by the same anonymous Jesuit artist whose map of Ayutthaya I showed you a moment ago, convey a sense of that journey. When Narai's envoys arrived at Versailles for their formal audience, as you see on the right, they processed through the palace courtyard to the sound of drums and trumpets that were meant to, quote, imitate the custom of the King of Siam, as one French courtier remarked. They then continued through the palace to the Hall of Mirrors, where Louis XIV was seated on a high throne at the far end of the room. For the occasion, the French king was decked out in a sumptuous yellow embroidered silk robe studded with diamonds that supposedly imitated a robe Narai had worn for his audience with Chaumont the year before. Louis XIV had dressed in similarly spectacular outfits when he received envoys from the Ottoman Empire in 1669 and from Persia in 1715, out of a desire to compete with the splendor of these Asian courts. During these ceremonies, all of which were captured in a number of almanac prints, he took steps, literally, to appear elevated and remote from his subjects, a practice that was more in keeping with the protocol of Asian rulers than with his own customs at court. Unfortunately, we don't know how the Siamese ambassadors, including the lead ambassador Kosapan, who's represented here, interpreted this royal display because the meticulous records they kept of their journey have been almost entirely lost or destroyed. All that survives are journals from Kosapan's time in Brest, where at one point he comments on how curious the French are to see him and says that for him, quote, it is exactly the same as I would like to see you, end quote. And we can observe a similar form of mutual curiosity in Louis XIV and Fra Narai's attempts to learn about each other and to adjust their court rituals accordingly. The period of France's initial engagement with Siam, from the 1660s to the 1680s, was one in which Louis XIV was formulating his imagery and ideology of absolute rule. In devising this program, he took cues from powerful Asian rulers whom he admired, including the emperors of China and Mughal India, as well as Narai. The king's printmakers also seemed to take cues from representations of these rulers that had illustrated contemporary travel accounts, such as Johann Nieuwhof's well-known description of a Dutch embassy to China from 1665. This iconic frontal portrayal of Louis XIV on his throne was not a typical way of representing French kings at the time, and I'm wondering if it could have been inspired by European depictions of the Chinese emperor, or even perhaps by Chinese imperial portraits that may have circulated in some form in Europe around this time. And I know that this is a speculative point, but I also know that there's some people here in the audience today who may be able to help me out with this. We do know that Nieuwhof's description of China inspired the development of the architecture, landscape, and protocol at Versailles. The Sun King's propagandists repressed these multiple influences or tried to pass them off as French, and still today we tend to think of Versailles and its rituals as having sprung Athena-like from the head of Louis XIV. Aided by 19th century European writers who had their own reasons for amending this earlier history of mutual engagement and exchange, we are less familiar with its flexible, symmetrical relations between East and West than with the Orientalist narrative of Western power and control that French members of the later 1861 embassy set out to construct. I imagine that most of the people in this room, however, are familiar with the impact that trade and diplomatic contact with Asia had on European art, fashion, and decor. And so now I'm going to shift in this third and final portion of my presentation to focus on objects exchanged between France and Siam in the 1680s and on mirrors in particular. The bottom part of this print depicts a small portion of the gifts that the Siamese ambassadors brought with them, including Asian lacquerware and more than 1,500 pieces of Chinese and Japanese porcelain. And I actually noticed there's a little automata figure here. I'm dealing more with the 1,500 pieces of porcelain, but there's a scholar named Sarah Benson who's worked more on the automata figures in their exchange for a volume that Daniela Bechmar and Peter Mancall edited called Collecting Across Cultures, if you're interested in reading more about that. So these gifts, which Narai hoped would signal his trading connections, fueled an already established porcelain craze in France, one that is exemplified by the Trianon de Porcelaine at Versailles. And I just couldn't resist throwing in this photograph of the blue and white table in the Getty's collection that was likely made for the porcelain Trianon. At the same time, these gifts spurred French artisans to capitalize on this craze by developing acceptable import substitutes, like the example of soft-paste porcelain from Saint-Cloud and Chantilly that you see on the left. This was also true of the Indian cotton and other Asian textiles that became popular in France around this time, which French manufacturers sought to imitate. Among them were Siamese, striped silk and cotton garments inspired by the robes that the Siamese ambassadors had worn when they visited France. Manufactured mainly in Rouen, these striped garments soon became staples of the French fashion industry and over time shed their exotic provenance. A major impetus behind the development of these French manufactories, at least from the monarchy's perspective, was to try to staunch the flow of gold and silver out of France to pay for these foreign luxury goods. Mercantilism, or Colbertism, certainly underlay the creation of the Royal Company of Glass and Mirrors, perhaps the most famous of the state-controlled manufactories of Louis XIV's reign. Founded in 1665, its goal was to produce mirrored glass that was equal or superior to the highly coveted Venetian mirrors that the French king and his subjects were spending vast sums of money on. Colbert had charged the French ambassador in Venice with persuading a group of Murano glassmakers to leave Venice undercover, come to France, and share the closely guarded secrets of their trade. The most famous commission that the French manufactory received, of course, was for the Hall of Mirrors, a room that aimed to outdo another mirrored reception room at the Royal Palace in Madrid. Upon its completion in November 1684, the Hall of Mirrors was hailed as a triumph of French art and industry, as well as the ultimate symbol of Louis XIV's absolute power, one that was meant to shock and awe all those who visited it. The large arched mirrors that spanned the room, which are actually comprised of more than 350 smaller panels of mirrored glass that are soldered together so as to appear seamless, also served as billboard advertisements for the foreign dignitaries who were received there. This commercial enticement apparently worked well on the Siamese ambassadors, who were said by French commentators to have been completely overwhelmed by the spectacle, and who placed an order for more than 4,000 mirrors on behalf of Narai for the royal palaces of Ayutthaya and Lopburi. When these mirrors arrived in Siam, many of them were used to decorate Narai's audience halls at these two palaces, where he had received Chaumont in 1685. On the left is an illustration of the audience hall at Ayutthaya that appeared in a travel account written by Simon de la Lubert, who led a second French embassy to Siam in 1687. You can see, at least in Lubert's interpretation, square-shaped mirrors that are placed all around the room. On the right is a photograph of the audience hall at Lopburi. The walls have been stripped, but you can get some sense of the space. Very little has been written about either one of these audience halls, but the general consensus, which also reflects French accounts at the time, is that Narai was inspired by Louis XIV to create his own Hall of Mirrors in Siam in order to signify his royal power, splendor, and European connections, as he was doing in other works of architecture and decor. For the last few minutes of my presentation, I want to complicate this reading while also proposing that there may have been more to these mirrors than meets the eye in terms of how they functioned within this diplomatic exchange. Like Louis XIV, Narai had been interested in mirrors from the outset of his reign. In 1657, he had tried to order more than 400 Venetian glass mirrors to ornament his palace from the Dutch VOC. Ultimately, the Dutch were unable to supply his demand, and the French crown must have gotten wind of this, because when Louis XIV sent a preliminary scouting mission to Siam in 1682, he included several mirrors among the gifts that he sent, which also included 2 samples of Savonnerie carpets and a selection of French textiles, gifts that befit the commercial alliance that he was trying to establish, and that they were intended more for trade than for tribute. And it's interesting that the Savonnerie carpets were actually destroyed during the journey, during the ship's passage, but they were still presented to the king, and they were described as samples for items that he could purchase. But there's a further dimension to these gifts that has never been explored, at least to my knowledge, and that may suggest another reason for why the French crown was interested in Siam at this moment, not just for its trading connections, but for the raw materials that it possessed. Siam, as French travelers and diplomats from the 1680s reported, was a rich source of sapin wood and of tin, both of which played an important role in the development of the textile and mirror industries in France. Go back to this for just a second. Sapin wood could be boiled to create a red dye that was used for everything from royal carpets to French fabrics inspired by Indian cotton designs. Tin was frequently used as a mordant for these fabrics, as well as an ingredient for military weapons, but it was also essential for the production of tin amalgam mirrors, the dominant technology used to make mirrors from the 16th to the early 20th century. Originally developed in Venice, but then brought to France in the 1660s, the process involved sliding a glass plate over tinfoil that was coated with mercury, as you see these workers doing in a plate from the Encyclopédie on the right. The French Royal Mirror Company struggled in the first 2 decades of its existence, partly because of difficulties with procuring tin. As Jacques Savary de Prulon explains in his influential 1723 Dictionnaire du Commerce, England was the primary source of tin in Europe, but the British had imposed heavy tariffs on their French rivals, leading the latter to seek out alternative sources. They were able to purchase some tin from the Dutch, most of which came from Siam, but they were largely cut off from this supply during the Franco-Dutch Wars of the 1670s. I don't think it's a coincidence that this was the same period in which the French East India Company began to seek out active trade relations with Siam. In 1680, the company sent a ship to the Siamese island of Phuket, specifically to obtain a large supply of tin that had been mined there. Here's a map showing Phuket's location in the center of what is still today Southeast Asia's tin belt. It's tempting to speculate that some of this Siamese tin may have ended up in the Hall of Mirrors, whose panes of mirrored glass only began to be manufactured around 1681, 3 years after work had begun on the rest of the room. This was also the year that Louis XIV sent his initial gift of mirrors to Noailles, suggesting not just trade per se, but perhaps a kind of corporate partnership. Noailles responded by giving the French company a monopoly on the tin trade in Phuket and by appointing a French governor to the island. Cosapin and his brother, who served as Noailles' foreign minister, had been involved in the negotiations. When the Siamese ambassadors entered the Hall of Mirrors, they may have been awed, but I doubt they were shocked. In more ways than one, it may have reminded them of home. Noailles had also ordered scores of mirrors from the French glass company the year before the Hall of Mirrors was completed, and 3 years before his ambassadors would have seen it, for his audience chamber at Le Pourri. He was not, therefore, as directly influenced or cowed by Versailles as historians have tended to assume. Given Noailles' interest in Islamic architectural and material culture, he may have been looking instead to the Palace of Mirrors or other mirrored rooms built for the Safavid Shah in Isfahan, with mirrors purchased from Venice or given as diplomatic gifts. But my final point is not that we should be looking for more accurate sources for these Siamese audience chambers or for any of these rooms. Rather, it is to emphasize how mirrors, perhaps paradoxically given their fragility, were literally and conceptually mobilized in the early modern period to express an image of royal power, one that could transcend cultural barriers and communicate in a way that words and pictures weren't always able to. They could serve as architectural metaphors for the so-called mirrors for princes literary tradition, one that was popular at both Islamic and European courts, or they could embody culturally specific notions of enlightenment. They could also signify global networks of production and exchange that, in the case of Versailles at least, have been downplayed in favor of a historiographic emphasis on the palace and its contents as quintessentially French. As a scholar and as a teacher of 17th century French architecture, my goal is to challenge this French or Eurocentric narrative and to view this royal site and the traditions it set in motion in a more decentered and global context. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd just like to make a few quick comments and then we'll open it up for questions. One thing I continually find so interesting is in this exchange between Europe and Asia that extends over several centuries is the degree to which monarchs and rulers imagine themselves and imagine forming empires and political boundaries, borrowing concepts or their imagining of how someone else might do it in Asia or in Europe. And to a large extent, I think we're still dealing today with the understandings and especially the misunderstandings that arise over these several centuries. And I'm particularly, it's interesting that in the case of Thailand is one of the only countries in Asia that was never colonized. And it's interesting how adept the Thai king was in fashioning his own foreign affairs, in keeping Thailand free from either the French, who were just to the east in Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, and the English, who were just immediately to the west in Burma. The only other country in Asia that was never colonized was Bhutan, or that never had any direct foreign colonial presence. Even China did along its coast. And of course, Japan is an exception. And that's another whole story. But it's interesting also in light of your talk, the incredible misunderstandings between England and China that arose in the 18th century when George III sent his most adept ambassador, Lord Macartney, to the Manchu court to try and establish a permanent trade embassy in Beijing, a mission that failed completely. And one of the most entertaining documents from that, which I just will refer you to, is the utterly contemptuous letter written by the Qianlong Emperor of China to George III of England. And if you want a good laugh that will also shatter any notions of Eurocentricity, read that letter. So we have a few minutes for questions.
I also just want to add to that, there's some really wonderful satirical cartoons, the James Gilray series of cartoons that are also aimed at, I think, making fun of both rulers, but George III in particular, and Douglas Fordham has written a wonderful article about these images. But yes, thank you for broadening out my study.
Yes. Yes.
Meredith, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about specifically the Isfahani sort of Shah Abbas the first, kind of actually Shah Abbas the second, if we're referring to the Ali Kapu, architectural language of kingship, and why perhaps it was that in particular that in Thailand, I mean, if it is indeed the source of even some architectural fabric of performing kingship, then I guess I'm just wondering how that came to be.
Well, I think cosmopolitanism was the link and the appeal for Narai, just in terms of looking back at the Safavid court. And there were a number of Persian merchants who were in Thailand at the time, and the problem is it's very hard to kind of document this history because the descriptions, the accounts are so partial. So there is this, you probably know the ship of Suleiman, the diplomatic account of an emissary who comes to Thailand in the late 1680s and who describes, who stresses Narai's interest. First of all, he says that Narai was actually, that Persian merchants who were in Thailand at the time actually facilitated his rise to power, and then that was one of the reasons why he rewarded them to such a great extent, and then perhaps arguably one of the reasons why he incorporated many of their kind of architecture and rituals into he was kind of paying homage to them. Who knows?
Oh, okay.
But for me, I think the link is really cosmopolitanism, and he was, again, this is a loaded source, but this account also talks about how he was keenly interested in gathering images and descriptions of foreign rulers, and in this case, the Shah in particular, but that's also, there are many other sources, European sources, Dutch sources, French sources, that talk about this interest and this curiosity, this kind of culture, this curiosity, and so I think that was the link. Okay.
Just then I'll convert it to a comment. I mean, I think perhaps it would be good to look a little further at that specific source, because it seems that there were many languages of, certainly architectural languages
Yes.
of royal performance, and meanwhile the cosmopolitanism is like a general beginning. I think there might be some specificity there that would do well to be examined.
Thank you.
Yes.
I was just curious if you could tell us about why these images of the reception of the Siamese assembly appear in almanacs. Oh.
It's a really great question, and I've done a little bit more work on this in a longer version of this presentation. One of the things that's really interesting to me is that this moment, the 1686 reception of the Siamese ambassadors at Versailles, this is seen kind of at the time, but especially in the 18th century, as the defining moment of Louis XIV's reign, the moment where he became this absolute monarch, and where he kind of displayed this royal system, this form of diplomatic protocol, which is also coded as French, although, as I said, it's kind of cobbled together from all of these different protocol systems that he was learning about, that it really kind of was put on in all its theatrical glory and display. So curious and kind of puzzling to me, why is there not one really grand history painting that's made of this moment, or why is it not represented in a tapestry project, a tapestry series of the king? And I think the answer to that, a little partial answer to that, is that it was supposed to be, and the Charles Le Brun drawing that I showed you at the beginning of the talk is a kind of preparatory study, either for a painting or probably for a tapestry, or maybe both, but that, again, I don't really know why, but was not actually made. But there were these, this is the example that I'm talking about, but there were these almanac prints, and I mean, a kind of preliminary thing that I can say about it is that this was a moment in which Louis XIV was actually trying to reach a broader audience in terms of his royal propaganda. It's a moment in which the king was being criticized all over Europe, and in France. I mean, press censorship kind of limited the amount of criticism that could be leveled against the king, but criticized for instance, I mentioned this almanac print in particular, and these representations of Ottoman territories that had been taken over by this European coalition known as the Holy League. Well, in this print, Louis XIV is actually taking credit for, it's called the little banner here, proclaims the triumphs of the church under Louis the Great, under Louis XIV, but he actually didn't join the Holy League and was in an alliance, as I'm sure you know well, with the Ottoman Empire in this period. So these prints actually worked against, or at least kind of fought against, some of these criticisms that were being leveled against him at the time. And they were also, they circulated in France, but then they too were also taken abroad, along with prints of the Cabinet du Roi, sometimes as diplomatic images. And there's so little. I know that Louis Marcassano, who is working on an exhibition of these almanac prints, and we're finding out more information about them, but we still don't know as much as we would like to about their production or their circulation. But that's kind of what I can say about them at this point, and that's what I think they were trying to do.
Yes, right here.
I was going to ask you something that's linked to it. It seems as though these visits of the Siamese ambassadors, 1595, I think 1615, 16 was another one, were very well documented. We have several festival books for their entry into Rome, and those were the early ones. And so I think the reason for the almanac print, to respond myself, is because this is another way of, it's news, and it's documenting it, and they want to show it. My question was, were these some of the singular visits of such ambassadors from Asia to Europe, and is that why so much was made of them, or were there other similar ambassadorial visits?
Do you mean in France at the time, or in, I mean, no, I mean, the Louis XIV actually received an envoy from the Ottoman Empire in 1669, and then also this Persian embassy in 1715. And he'd received another embassy from Thailand 2 years before. I think, so they weren't unique. I think they just provided an opportunity for a really lavish display because of the level of curiosity, public curiosity, court curiosity about these foreign visitors. And I think the 1686 embassy in particular was seen as really this shining moment, because the embassy that had arrived 2 years before, they weren't official ambassadors, at least in terms of how the French understood Siamese diplomatic protocol, and so they felt that they were really, that finally, that these figures, the brother of Franarai's foreign minister, for instance, were coming to Versailles. This was really kind of an opportunity to create this lavish spectacle. But it wasn't, I'd say that it was kind of unique in terms of representations of inter-European embassies, which didn't attain the same degree of, there weren't as many images made of them, and they weren't quite the same amount of spectacle, but that there were others that, and that's part of what my project is doing, is actually comparing them and thinking about moments of convergence, but also departure. Thank you.
Yes, up there.
I just wondered what happens between, I really appreciated the way you kind of began with the 19th century images and then brought us back. But isn't it the case that this Siamese king doesn't do so well? In other words, he's overthrown, so the guy who the French, are all in bed with gets gone, and he's not cosmopolitan, the next guy, and he is all shut off from the West. And so could you kind of maybe fill us in on what happens between the 17th century and this 19th century viewing of something that happened when that history was so uncontinuous, let's say. And have you thought about that at all?
Yes, I think you could refer to it as the limits of cosmopolitanism, because that was a major factor in the undoing of the monarch of the late 17th century that I was referring to. And yes, also the relationship between France and Siam, while it kind of got both of them very excited, was really short-lived, because in 1688 the monarch was overthrown, and there was a period of kind of retreat from the cosmopolitanism, if that's the term that you want to call it, of his regime, and there was a series of monarchs during the period who were less kind of inclined to invite merchants, diplomats, to have this kind of very diverse population that Norai had. And then in 1767, there was an invasion. Burmese forces destroyed the palace of Ayutthaya, and the monarchy was then kind of recreated in a different form, a different group of monarchs entirely at the very end of the 18th century, so around 1782. And that's the new monarchy that Rama IV is ultimately connected to. And it actually, I can't remember exactly, I think that the first monarch in 1782, he's actually related to Kosapan, the first ambassador, the lead ambassador of the 1686 embassy. So in any event, in the 19th century, these monarchs of this new regime began to look back on this moment, and they see it as much more important for establishing their own royal identity. In terms of what Stephen was mentioning earlier about trying to maintain Siam's sovereignty partially by kind of incorporating and establishing alliances and relationships with the West, with France, England, and the US, and again, in trying to play these different powers off one another. And it's partly about this idea of trying to not be colonized, but then it's also partly about shaping this new royal identity, this new identity for the Thai elites. And for that reason, that's why it's very important for them to look back at that moment in history, because they see it as mirroring their own. But they use it very selectively in the way that the 19th century French diplomats who were hosting this 1861 mission used this history very selectively as well. But thank you for that question.
We have time maybe for one more. Yes.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. I also like the historical conversation within the paper. I have two short questions. Maybe you won't have time to answer both of them. The first one is about this almanac print and who it's meant for, and whether this display of Louis' magnificence and cosmopolitanism, his capacity to recruit, these ambassadors of this powerful distant monarch, if this is meant to impress only the French, or if it's meant to impress other European monarchs. I mean, is this something that is meant for other people to be impressed with and to play within intra-European politics?
Right.
And the other question is about the role of religion in here. You mentioned in the Almanac the League of Heroes, or whatever it's called. And the print on the right, there is a priest prominently there, and other embassies from Asia to Europe at this time have to do with missionary activity and conversion. And so is religion part of this at all?
Yes. So the first question, were these meant to impress European monarchs as well, or to have an audience outside of France? And the answer to that is yes, but again, it's really hard to document sort of where these prints traveled. And so, and another thing to say about them is that I think that was the intention, but it didn't actually work out that way, because, again, I was talking about some of the criticism that Louis XIV was subjected to in the 1680s, first for his alliance with the Ottoman Empire, but also for his revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which is where the religious question comes in, and some of these printmakers, Protestant printmakers, ended up going to England and to the Netherlands, and actually they were making these prints that were really damning critiques that inverted the language of almanac prints and represented, for instance, there's this fake medallic history of Louis XIV that's printed in 1693 that shows Louis XIV kowtowing before the Ottoman Sultan, but using the language of diplomacy that's being sort of circulated through these prints. So in that sense, we can argue that yes, they did circulate, but at the same time, they didn't kind of function in the way that they were meant to. And then religion is an important part of the story, partly that this is, I think because of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, this is a period when Louis XIV, I'll be super quick because I know we have to move on, is trying to emphasize his status as the sort of Catholic leader of the world, and his mission to Siam is part of that. There's this kind of rumor that he might be able to convert Franerai to Catholicism, which missionaries are actually kind of fueling that rumor because they themselves want resources and support in terms of where they are. But that is a part of the story that I guess just in the interest of time I didn't flesh out in this talk, but we can talk about it more if you like.
Great.
Thank you.
I'd like now to introduce Dana Leibsohn, who is Priscilla van der Poel Professor of Art at Smith College. She has such a long list of publications, I'm not going to waste your time with that, but I just want to mention well, it's online, I think. No, we want to hear you. Most recently, she has co-edited a volume, Seeing Across Cultures, Visuality in the Early Modern Period. She has done a great deal of research on the relationship of Mexico, in particular, to Asia. And she speaks to us today on coins for candles, Asian commodities, and the visual culture of Spanish America. Please welcome Dana Leibsohn.
Okay, give me a moment to forestall the Marco Rubio thing, yeah? Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this conference. Thank you for coming. I realize I'm the only person standing between you and a reception, so we're going to do my best here. This afternoon, I'd like to speak about objects that could be bought and sold, traded, used up, and liquidated. Objects that today we might call commodities. My interest in the mobility turns on the value created through such transformations, especially as they touched indigenous lives in the 17th and 18th centuries in Spanish America. As you'll see, my paper highlights practices of consumption and circulation that would have been familiar to many in the early modern past. The issue on my mind, though, is not strictly comparative. My comments are driven, at least in part, by an anxiety. I realize it may not be flattering to admit this, but it is late in the day, and I think I should be frank. As I prepared for this conference, I began to worry about objects and people that were once numerous, but have left only the faintest traces of their passage through the world. The question that guides this paper, then, concerns just that. Is there a reason to study that which is nearly invisible in the history of early modern trade? And if so, is that reason a good one? This painting, which is well known among scholars of colonial Mexican art, depicts an indigenous woman from New Spain, Sebastiana Inés Josefa de San Agustin. It measures about 2.5 feet in height, and today it hangs in the Museo Franz Mayer, which is in Mexico City and not far from the convent this woman would enter in the mid-18th century. The legitimate daughter of indigenous nobles, Sebastiana was 16 years old when the painting was made, which was in 1757. This much we know from the Spanish writing in the cartouche in the upper left corner. I have found no document that describes the image or its commission, but we can see that Sebastiana dressed well for the occasion. Pearls crown her head, lace and jewels spill down her arms. A wee peel trimmed with silk covers her torso. And I know many of you know this, but that's this garment here, which in central Mexico was a kind of quintessential garment for indigenous women. It dates originally from pre-Hispanic times, and it was worn through the colonial period. As if to meet our eyes, Sebastiana looks outward with the intensity of a self-possessed subject. In equal parts, the portrait exudes elegance and watchful stillness. From archival records, we know that social events would soon lead Sebastiana to the only convent open to daughters of high-born native families, Corpus Christi in Mexico City. At the end of my paper, I'll return to her residence in that convent. For now, I want to underscore the optimism of her portrait. On the cusp of adulthood, this painting implies, Sebastiana occupied a world infused with cosmopolitan desires for foreign and local objects, things that could adorn women's bodies and transport them to new planes of social worth. To be sure, the clothes and jewels Sebastiana wears, the objects she displays, tethered her to geographies far away from Tlatelolco, which was her home community. Whether this would have been of interest to Sebastiana, we do not know. For us today, however, the value of the portrait, not to mention the value of the luxuries it displays, can hardly be imagined without invoking the worldly circulation of material goods. A desire to purchase things from elsewhere and the practices of such acquisition very quickly leads to conversations about money. Marx, Simmel, and more than a few others have taught us that money is both concept and object. Its value derives from principles of abstraction, but also material form. The complexities of this in 16th century Spain have recently been explored by Elvira Filches, and her work provides one touchstone for what follows. So too does the Peter Stalebras essay on Marx's coat, which argues for the slippery nature of commodity exchange, an exchange that takes on meaning, according to his argument, along axes that are biographical and deeply material, not strictly ideological or economic. As the papers presented earlier today have made clear, in many instances and settings, neither circulation nor the mobility of objects necessarily required money. This was also true in Spanish America. What was necessary in Spanish America, though, was silver. Silver as metal, silver as currency, silver as desired object. The image on the screen shows the front and back of an 8 real coin. This particular piece was minted in the Potosí in the 17th century, and it's the kind of object that has become emblematic of Spanish America's contribution to global exchange. While the rise and fall of mine productivity, price points, and shifting world equivalents of silver were not small concerns in the 17th and 18th centuries, it is the material and imagined experience of silver, as well as the goods that silver could buy, that I'm going to highlight this afternoon. By far, the vast majority of people in Spanish America encountered silver as liturgical objects, perhaps as you see it here, hammered into sheets and covering a festival cart that could be pulled through the streets on holy days. Silver was something that could be polished, it could be melted and poured, pounded and cast. It could be transformed into objects that were beautiful, objects befitting the holy. It could also cross borders in exchange for foreign goods and to sweeten requests for diplomatic favors. Silver could not become just anything, but its path to the early modern world was paved by its malleability. And I would say that when we're thinking about metaphors and words that help us understand the mobility of objects in this period, I'd like to throw malleability out on the table, because I think it opens, again, it's not going to be perfect, but it opens a number of possibilities for thinking about openness, resist, what can move and what can't, how things change as they do move. For all that malleability, though, there were also hard realities. Silver had to be mined, it had to be minted. And we miss a significant part of the story of early modern mobility if we leave unacknowledged the thousands of indigenous people and slaves, often working in frighteningly abusive conditions, who scraped silver from deep within mountains, the people who turned liquefied metal into ingots and coin in the dry heat and freezing cold of Spanish America's midst. For more than just a few then, the value and circulation of silver had little to do with the coins as lovely as the one I showed a moment ago. I'm showing you here 2 17th century cob coins, and coins of this type were those that were more commonly released into daily economies. While coinage was important, most people did not walk the streets of Mexico with change jingling in their pockets. This may seem a simple point, but the economies of exchange that dominated daily life, for wealthy and poor alike, were driven largely by credit and barter. One setting where coins from Spanish America were essential, though, was Manila. And every year, coins were sent in no small quantity across the Pacific. On the screen is an image of Manila Bay, and the city you can see towards the back here. Manila was the primary entrepot for Asian merchandise in the Hispanic world. In a now famous account, Historical Events of the Philippine Islands, Antonio de Morga, a colonial official serving the crown in Manila, describes ships arriving from India and Japan, Borneo, and China. Published in 1609, his account explains that some merchandise would stay in the Philippines, but much of it would travel to Mexico, where it would be taxed and sold. Of course, some of that merchandise, in a kind of seemingly endless journey, would be transshipped from Mexico across the Atlantic to Spain. But Manila and what happened there was one of de Morga's primary concerns. This view of the city, which was painted onto the lid of a chest and is now in a museum in Mexico City, you see the walls of the city, and we get some sense of the ethnic diversity of Manila. The center part of the town or the city would have been dominated by Spaniards and Spanish institutions, with outlying communities dominated by Chinese, Japanese, and indigenous residents. This is the Parian, the Chinese part of the community, for those of you who know Manila. I have no image from de Morga's time that captures the bustle of the port, but he notes that Chinese merchants brought the most coveted merchandise: silk, velvets, taffetas, embroideries of silver and gold. They also brought beds, table covers, pillows and rugs, desks, chairs, tables, and benches. Traders from Japan came with great quantities of wheat, suits of armor and other weapons, painted screens, writing cases, and lacquered boxes. And Portuguese traders, who made stops in Macau, Malacca, and India, arrived with slaves and spices, jewels, and dried fruit. I show you here a blue and white porcelain vessel of the kind that certainly would have traveled from China to Manila in this period. I've chosen this particular vessel because it's linked to de Morga. It was lost on a ship that he lost at sea. So it was excavated several years ago, and it's now in the Museo Naval. One thing that's interesting to me about de Morga's account is he doesn't mention prices at all, although he talks about sort of the pace and process of trade. He also is completely silent about porcelain. But clearly he would have known about porcelain. In many ways, the de Morga account constructs trade as spectacle. He seems captivated by the array of choices, how much merchandise is on offer, how varied the possibilities. He also calls attention to the origin site of specific goods. Furniture from Macau, for instance, is distinguished from that of Japan. Jewels from India are described separately from those of Thailand. If we set his writing alongside that of other authors, we find that spectacle and geography were tropes for understanding foreign merchandise that circulated widely in Hispanic writings of the day. The most persistent trope of all, however, involved worry, specifically worry about money. Spanish writers expressed great anxiety about the wealth of the Americas draining westward. And clearly, they weren't the only ones expressing that anxiety. They were worried about money draining into the hands of Asian traders, specifically Chinese merchants and officials. Their fear did have some foundation. To give you just one rather blunt economic measure, in the 17th century, nearly 1/3 of the silver mined in the New World was sent to China. In some years, the amount seems to have come closer to 35%. There is, of course, a Chinese side to the story, and the Chinese demand for silver was never as simple as Spanish documents suggest. Neither, though, was the Spanish demand. The Chinese may have been greedy for silver, which was another Spanish trope, and they may have accepted nothing but coin, as more than one colonial official claims. But Spanish desires for Asian merchandise were also strong motivators. The goods on offer were apparently enticing enough for people to send boatloads of silver coins across an ocean. This impulse and behavior had parallels in other parts of the world. Yet we should not be hasty and presume that porcelain and silk in Mexico carried the same evocative or economic force as it did in Amsterdam or Constantinople. Craig Clunas has written, with more than a bit of skepticism, about the interpretive lure of Me Too, in which circulation is explained by the arrival of Asian goods almost everywhere in the early modern world. I take his point, and so want to turn to some of the ways that objects from Asia settled into indigenous lives in Mexico. I suspect the mechanics of this are familiar, but every year, 1 or 2 galleons made the crossing from Manila to Acapulco. And I've just recut the map here to help you with your geography. Here's Manila, here's Acapulco. These were the 2 legal ports that were open to trade during this period. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. Moving on. In Acapulco, an image of which I show you here, there was an annual fair after the galleons arrived. When the imported goods went on sale, the scrappy little port town sprung to life. And you get a sense, here's the fort. I need my glasses. Where's the fort? Sorry. Here's the sprinkle. Sorry, I'm back. Here's the sprinkle of the town down here. The fort's up there. The idea was that Acapulco was a terrible place to live. You read this in a number of documents until the galleons arrived, and then everybody came, and then everybody left. Silk was the most common trans-Pacific commodity sold in Acapulco, but also important was wax, which was called Chinese, even though it was produced largely in the Philippines. Indeed, many of the nuances of Asian geography never made it across the Pacific Ocean. By the time merchandise arrived in Mexico, which could take 6 months or longer, so the Manila-Acapulco trip sometimes took between 8 or 9 months on occasion. Not a nice trip, right? By the time that journey was completed, a good deal of the merchandise had become simply Chinese. This image was painted in New Spain by Pedro Calderón early in the 18th century. The painting measures about 5 feet in height, and it's a portrait of the Christ of Chalma, a town in southwest Mexico that in the 16th century fell under the auspices of Augustinians and their conversion projects. The offerings set upon the altar, silver and wax, porcelain and blossoms, the conjoining of sacred and mundane things, are striking in their heterogeneity. And I should say that the church in Chalma is still in worship, although the altar doesn't look like this anymore. Some of these objects may have come from gardens nearby, some from thousands of miles away, some certainly from the painter's imagination. Yet the stillness of the scene implies a nearly seamless fit. If there was anything disquieting about placing Mexican silver next to Chinese vases, the painting does not let on. Permanence and ephemera also form a crucial aspect of the scene, and because of my interest in objects that leave little trace, I'm going to single out the long golden tapers whose flames dissolve into smoke at the edge of the scene. I think there's a story of ephemera also to be told with the blossoms, but I'm not going there today. Among the most fugitive of commodities, candles were fundamental to religious and ceremonial life in New Spain, indeed, across much of the Catholic world. In Mexico City, a guild for candle makers formed in the 16th century, and although blacks and mulattoes were legally barred, indigenous people could apprentice and, when approved, sell candles from their homes. Wax for candles like these might be produced locally, but it was also imported. Thick cakes of white and yellow wax traveled from Manila to Mexico, some of those cakes weighing upwards of 100 pounds. Alejandra Irigoyen has been examining the role of merchants and religious institutions in the trans-Pacific wax trade, and she's found that both groups jealously defended their rights to ship wax into Mexico, in part because profits could be handsome. The production of Chinese wax implicated indigenous labor, since certain groups in the Philippines paid tribute in wax. It also required silver to buy those waxy cakes in Mexico, which would be melted down, formed into candles, and sold to those who could afford them. Wax was also imported from Spain. Indeed, each of these sources, Asia, Mexico, and Spain, produced candles with distinctive properties. Documents suggest that the candles of Spanish and Chinese wax were the most desirable, since foreign wax was thought to produce the cleanest burn. I'd like to tell you that the silver candlesticks on the Chalma altar hold tapers of Chinese wax. It's possible, but I can't be sure. People bought the best wax that they could. They also bought as many candles as finance would allow. In indigenous towns, the need for candles surged on the cusp of death. I've been looking at wills from central Mexico, some of them produced in towns quite close to Chalma, and one of the most common requests is that personal belongings be sold for masses and candles to honor the deceased. My research so far has focused on 17th century documents, and especially wills of women. Typically, cooking implements, skirts, and weepeels are items released into the world in exchange for money to purchase candles and prayers. Beeswax burns slowly, time enough for one's life to be remembered, one's soul to take flight. In a few documents, Chinese porcelain, plates, not vases like the one I showed you a moment ago or that sit on this altar, are among the personal possessions that were to be liquidated. I've not yet found evidence of what we might call a kind of quid pro quo, in which a woman requests Chinese porcelain be sold for Chinese wax. Did it happen? Probably. That kind of matching, though, is not necessary to my larger point, which is that the end game of circulation, at least for some indigenous people, was as ephemeral and as weighty as the entry of a soul into heaven, a desire shared by many across the early modern world. It's with this that I return us to Sebastiana, her portrait, and the issues I raised at the beginning of this paper. Every scholar who has written about this painting notes the wealth on display. There is the cloth, not only the gorgeous weepeel, but the lace that would have rustled when Sebastiana raised her arm, the cool silk she would have felt upon her skin. Also stunning is the jewelry. Emeralds dangle from her ears, pearls sparkle in her hair, and catch light as they cascade down her arm. The written record on Sebastiana and her family is spare. I think it's safe to say very, very spare. So it's hard to know how much here is artifice, how much is fact. In the mid-18th century, times were hard in Tlatelolco, but it would not have been out of the question for an indigenous noble of significant means to own precious stones, imported cloth, and fans, or even portraits. When it comes to indigeneity and circulation, it is the weepeel and the pearls that should catch our eye. Poor indigenous women wore weepeels, but so too did those who could afford expensive fabric. And the weepeel of Sebastiana is among the most beautiful indigenous garments to have been preserved in paint on canvas. Her weepeel was likely made from, or at least trimmed with, imported silk. Sebastiana thus wears a local creation that came into being through the economies of foreign trade and exchange. We might say something similar of her subjectivity, but that's going to be another paper. Weepeels, we know, were sold for masses and candles, and indigenous women could leave weepeels to their daughters, creating weepeel heirlooms, if you will. Records from the end of the 18th century, however, suggest that weepeels, in contrast to other items of indigenous women's clothing, were almost never pawned. Apparently, weepeels were not the kind of object a woman sold for cash in desperate times. And this should remind us how the circulation of intimate things could have its own rules, its own set of values. The case was different with pearls. In Mexico City, pearls would have been imported from South America, from Asia, and from Europe. Not all of these pearls had equal value. Not everyone purchased them in the same way. We sense this from the Costa painting on the screen, which shows a mulata wearing a necklace of pearls and pendant earrings. Poor women bought pearls one by one, as finance allowed. When things became bleak, pearls turned into collateral. They could be sold, again, pearl by pearl, to raise cash or to barter for things more necessary than jewels. In contrast, women of means acquired pearls in strings, either as heirlooms or gifts, and this would likely have been the case with Sebastiana. And yet, as with the Costa, her pearls were not immune from economics. We don't do that, let's do this one. Sebastiana would have taken a dowry with her to Corpus Christi, and I'm showing you here a contemporary view of the convent facade in downtown Mexico City. Indeed, one reason her portrait is so poignant is that it depicts a life of opulence that is about to disappear. For the same year that the portrait was painted, she entered the Franciscan convent and began a life that was far more harsh and spare in material terms, although presumably more rich in spirituality. Ilona Katsu has argued that this portrait may have been given to Corpus Christi as part of the dowry. It would not have been offered alone, however. While we cannot know with certainty, the pearls and other jewels displayed in the portrait might well have formed part of this young woman's dowry. This suggests that the jewels Sebastiana wears are not just signs of her wealth, nor signs of the luxuries that she will soon leave behind. They were also objects whose very circulation would allow her to shift from one kind of life into another. Seen in this light, the painted pearls become signs of possibility, of transformation, of the opportunity to pursue the life of a nun. It's tempting here to talk about who gets left out of the historical record when we talk about early modern trade, and particularly its global reach. I think that's an important topic and one with very real political implications, but I'm going to veer in a different direction to bring my comments to a close. Much exists in the world to remind us that histories are formed through the movement of people and the circulation of things. In some cases, the most binding translocations were local. In other instances, they involved the crossings of oceans. In the case of Sebastiana, the circulations that mattered most required crossing imagined geographies, as well as those that were physical. And for me, this is crucial. While there are many ways to make sense of mobility in the early modern past, I find that our tolerance for that which is evocative and not just documentary remains undervalued. Of course, it's no simple task to historicize that which has no material form, that which barely surfaces in the historical record. This may be why our thinking about objects tends to privilege that which we can still see, still touch, the things whose pleasures and prices are registered in text. Yet objects work by beckoning, not simply recording. And images such as this one also remind us that the history of objects needs to account for aspiration. Circulation and mobility were motivated by dreams, not only actions. Overlook this, I would say, and we will never see the value of the imagined worlds of those who lived in the past. Thank you. Sure.
Questions? Yes.
Dana, thank you so much. That was really just a beautifully delivered paper. And it occurs to me that we've kind of made an interesting turn. In the morning, we were talking about things that were rare, unique, and exotic, and kind of obviously recognizable in many ways. And so I really appreciate this turn to think about commodities in terms of questions of relative sameness and invisibility. But obviously, making that leap as an art historian, I mean, the one thing that we try to offer the world is our visual analysis, and this is obviously a kind of limitation in terms of the kinds of questions that you're asking. So I'm just wondering if you could kind of, I don't know, maybe address the limitations of the discipline in terms of this work and kind of think about methodologically what we do with this if we're going to ask these really compelling questions that can't be answered visually.
Yes.
But maybe that might be too big.
No. I think that hits at the heart of what this conference, well, one heart, we don't have more than one heart. It hits at the heart of this conference in certain ways, and that is, what is it that we do when we ask about mobility of objects? And in some ways, I put the stress on mobility in this talk rather than on objects. I think it's the art historical impulse to do the other, which is to put the emphasis on objects that then move. And I guess my argument in part here is that we miss a big piece of the story if we tether ourselves to only those things we can actually touch, see, to only the questions we think we can prove answers to. You're right, visual analysis, what we can see, the material qualities of things are hardly incidental, and they weren't incidental in the past either. But I worry that we won't ask all the interesting questions we can if we keep ourselves tethered in the same ways. So I think there are places we should give ourselves permission, and I think there are places and moments we can give ourselves permission, and there are other places where maybe not so much. And part of the game is to know how to tack back and forth, yeah? So I guess I'd make that as a kind of first gesture at your question, which I think is not a little one, but not an unimportant one. Do I choose? You choose. Right there? Yeah, it is. And actually, we were talking at lunch about all the things in the portrait I'm not going to talk about. But because yes, I could go back to the coin. Right, it's true. It's a silver coin. Having looked at this portrait in person a number of times to get to the what do we do when we can't see, when you can see, it's very hard to know whether it is a piece of silver or actually a coin. And I don't know that it's very hard to tell what it is, but it's certainly something glistening and silver. Yeah. It could be silver from Potosi. It would be nice. I'm thinking of the paper you're giving that's coming that's got that beautiful mountain of Potosi in it. I think it's more likely silver from Zacatecas. The Mexican source would have been more likely because in Mexico City that would have been a much more direct route. There are inventories where people talk about having chests, rich people, chests of silver coins, but that's not what most people were doing. So her wealth, I think, is signaled by the coin or the silver. I'm really struggling, and maybe some of you can help me here with this, I'm really struggling with how much here in this portrait tells us what she owned as a wealthy woman and how much of it is that imaginative, aspirational kind of image. And the reason I'm struggling with that is that when I look at indigenous wills, sure, there is some wealth discussed, but boy, I've yet to find anything from the 17th or 18th centuries that comes close to this. So part of what I think we're seeing here is a language of portraiture and aspiration to convert into a convent and not simply the things she owns. But that's a theory.
Yes, here.
You can have both mics.
Dana, thank you so much for your paper. It's really terrific. And this is related, I think the mic's not working.
Actually, Stephen, I can repeat your question if you want.
I will have every mic in the room before we are done. All right. All right. So Dana, I loved what you had to say, and I love your ability to sort of think about something you cannot see or cannot touch. And I'm coming into this as someone who is in both African and contemporary, where we are often talking about things. I'm jealous of all of you because the amount of documents you have, we have nothing. And so, if you're talking about Masquerade, or even thinking about the work that your colleague Fraser Ward does on performance, oftentimes we have to talk about things that we could not ever have seen.
Right.
And so, what do you're talking about Caprona happening 25 years after it happens, and you were too young to have been there or too old. What you then have to think about, what do you do, or how do you talk about a masquerade if you're a female and cannot see it? What are the other things that you can do? There's sound, there's audience, and I think one of the elephants in the room for all of these papers is audience.
Yes,
and how does
absolutely.
audience, who is seeing this? Who's it intended for? And so I think methodologically, I don't think I have a question, actually. I'm not sure I have a question, but I think what you have is this amazing opportunity to borrow from other fields. Right. And see how they do this kind of work and bring it into your own work. And that, if I see any sort of resistance to the day, is of scholars in your field not looking at other fields and seeing how they do their work.
Right. No, I think your point is well taken. And I don't know if others who work on the early modern period would agree with me, but I sense a real anxiety if there are no documents. And I'm jealous of the documents that the people who work on the VOC have. They've got records and receipts and things I would love to be able to read. I think when we talk about sort of the fetishisms of our work in the early modern field, to not spend some time in an archive, to not work with pieces of paper, ooh, that's scary. Right? And so in terms of sort of where we borrow, I think we're willing to borrow from anthropology, from history, and it's that kind of document fetish. So I think your point is I would say your point is very well taken, is that we might also not only ask look more broadly about, or think more broadly about questions, but we might think more broadly about where else we could look for insight in terms of methodological models. Yeah, I think you're right.
This one works. Thank you, Dana. Thanks. I want to ask a question that is really more, I'm asking for guidance here. So as an early modernist and in complete appreciation of this impulse to, let's say, try to reconstruct, if I understand this correctly, a set of desires and a set of anxieties about objects that may or may not be permanent, fugitive, actual, aspirational. The scope of your paper was quite large, historically speaking, and I just wondered if you could comment on how you frame that, how necessary that scope is to what you want to do, and whether there's added value to taking the really big picture in terms exactly of what you're trying to reconstruct. Right. So, as I say, it's
yeah, no, that's a great question. I would say that one reason for the particularly broad scope today was the particularly narrow scope of the time frame I had to speak. So there is a kind of inverse proportion to the 25 minutes versus the 200 years. But one of the things that scholars who work on the Manila galleon trade often do, and that's really what the Asia piece of this in some ways falls into, is we tend to look at the span of the trade, which late 16th century to early 19th century. In a project that I'm doing that focuses specifically on Asia and Mexico, I'm much more interested in how things change between the 17th and the 18th centuries. And I think that is an important distinction to be drawn. The distinction doesn't happen at 1700, but what we see after 1700, maybe sort of 1680s, and I think this won't surprise many in the room, is we see a much stronger orientalizing set of practices in Mexico. It's not that there's nothing earlier, and Sophia, who's here somewhere, can talk a little bit about, or has talked about, Japanese influence in some of the ways that it inspired biombo production in Mexico quite early. But one of the things that's interesting to me is how the 17th and 18th centuries differ, and I think there's definitely a moment and a place to make that distinction. So you're right to raise the issue of temporality, but today was a broad stroke day. Yeah? It was about everything that melts away in broad strokes. How's that?
Yes.
I really enjoyed your presentation. I wondered, however, you mentioned history. Is it really that we don't study the things that are disappeared? Because the field of ephemera or material culture, really take that on tremendously, and it's just kind of an art history where that distinction tends to fall out because there's something about durability or value or transmission over time. But anyone who works on the low or popular culture has always studied ephemera. So I guess I wonder, really, then, if you take that to be the case, what would be the specific intervention of your emphasis on that?
I think that one of the points I was trying to make when I said that art history of the scholars of early modernity draw heavily from history is the reliance on documents to recreate the kinds of worlds that we're interested in recreating. Art history, I think, has a bad reputation, which is increasingly not a real reputation for only looking at the high, the beautiful, the lovely, the narrow, connoisseurial. And I think that sort of still circulates, even though that's less and less true. So I take your point about ephemera, the low, the things that pass, as being very much part of certain art historical discourses. I think that what I'm trying to suggest here is that if we look at what little pieces of evidence we have and ask how they help us understand what we can't see, rather than only what we can see, that there's something to be learned that we don't learn often enough. So I guess that's what I would sort of say in response to your provocation, yeah? Do we get to drink now? No. Oh. One more question. Elena, you're keeping us from drinking.
Just one more layer of interest in this portrait that you show, which is that the indigenous garment, the huipil that she's wearing, in fact, is covered with Spanish iconography.
Exactly.
Crowned double-headed eagles
Right.
that are woven into her indigenous garment.
Right,
So
right.
you have this other...
The sort of layering of, absolutely.
Right,
and
right.
we do have a few portraits of indigenous women who have either just become nuns or are about to become nuns. We don't have many of them, but one of the reasons we have them is because they ended up in convents. And that iconography is very interesting in terms of the way it's an indigenous garment with references to things that would not have been so indigenous early on.
And also what I would say is that to the issue of materiality and research tools, that one of the difficulties for those of us interested in these types of, this period and this place, is that there are these beautiful portraits of people wearing indigenous garments, and yet we have no preserved garments from this period. So we don't have the earliest huipil is maybe 18th century, maybe, but and almost then it doesn't really exist.
Right.
So we can only interpret from visual references, and so.
Thank you. Great. Sophie, how come it's my friends who are keeping us from drinking? They must know something
Elena
about me.
just got me thinking about when you were talking about this portrait and how we don't really have records of the types of accessories or jewels that these young women would have worn. Since she's holding a pink, the flower, it calls to mind other wedding portraits. I mean, because essentially,
Absolutely.
if she's about to enter
Right.
the church, it's
You're right.
essentially, she's marrying Christ.
Right. Absolutely.
But this idea of whether or not it's documentary or aspirational, it makes me think about looking at this portrait in comparison to other, Peruvian or other Mexican portraits of the time that are wedding portraits, and it just calls to mind one of the portraits in the Roberta Huber collection with the woman holding a pink. So it just got me thinking about that just now after Lynn mentioned the coats of arms, because I was thinking the same thing.
Great. Thanks for that comment. Thank you.